The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we're going to pick up the conversation again on the Belt and Road, and before everybody kind of turns off the podcast and says enough about the Belt and Road, really, you want to stay with us on this show because we're really all trying together to figure out what exactly is this thing. Now, over the past few weeks, we've had a couple of different shows where we've talked to different stakeholders and different analysts about their interpretations of Belt and Road. And one of the interesting things is that you don't get a consistent answer. Here in China, when I talk to scholars or I talk to business leaders and even people in the political world, each one tells me something different. And then when we talked to Zheng Zhu, who was the columnist at Caijing, he said it was purely an economic thing. And so I'm still confused, and here I am kind of working this out on the air to try and figure out what Belt and Road is. And Cobus, the other day I was looking through the news, and then I saw this headline from the Jackson Herald newspaper that covers Jackson County, Georgia. Now that's in northeastern Georgia, about as far away from the Belt and Road as you're ever going to get. And it was an editorial that said, China poised to dominate the world order. China's making moves that will eventually make it, not the U.S., the world's most dominant economic, military, and political country on earth. And I was thinking about that in the context of the Belt and Road, that maybe I've been thinking about this in all the wrong way. It's not a policy. It's not an agenda. This is a very Western American kind of, Eurocentric way of looking at politics. This is something far more ambiguous than just simply a policy or an agenda. And looking at that headline, it made me think that this is really about a new order for the world and the geopolitical structure rather than a specific policy.
Yeah, that is increasingly how I'm starting to look at it as well. And then when you talk about, usually when the phrase New World Order comes up, I mean, it's always very intimately connected to essentially who's going to run the world. When it was coined in the first Bush presidency in the early 90s, it was a way to talk about the decline of the Soviet Union and a kind of what came to be known as kind of a unipolar world arrangement. So it's very easy when that phrase comes up to look at it from kind of from the kind of a top-down perspective, and particularly to look at kind of dominant global powers. But I think there's a way of looking at the concept of a shift in a world order to also look at how all of the other smaller countries and other smaller entities are going to be rearranging their affairs, in order to reflect kind of larger changes in global power. And the fact that the Belt and Road has so much to do with all of these little arrangements, as these different countries, strike new deals with China, I think that itself kind of it opens the chance, the opportunity to talk about how world arrangements work outside of this idea of a unipolar situation or two big powers or whatever. Kind of like you can look at it from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
And that's why it's important for our discussion today in terms of where Africa fits in all of this, because understanding where Africa is on the Belt and Road and in this ecosystem, because I don't even know what the right word is, of what Belt and Road is going to be very important. So to get some perspective on this, we really couldn't have found anybody better. Bruno Maçães is the author of The Belt and Road, A Chinese World Order, a new book that's out this year. He's also the author of Dawn of Eurasia on the Trail of the New World Order, so 2 books about the world order. I told you this was the perfect guest for us. You may be familiar with Bruno. He's the former Portuguese Minister for European Affairs and also a senior non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute in New York. A very good evening, Bruno, from Beijing. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. It's a pleasure.
Well, I'm going to take go right into your book. I had a chance to read the whole thing this weekend, and it was, again, it really was very eye-opening for me because it allowed me to think about Belt and Road in a very different context. You said right early on in your book that the Belt and Road is not an entity with fixed rules. Rather, it is deliberately intended to be informal, unstructured, and opaque. So the lack of transparency in these Belt and Road deals that we're seeing all over the world, what was interesting for me is to think about that actually may be a feature and not a bug. I mean, everybody keeps calling for more transparency, but what you're saying is that there actually may be some intentionality to this. But the bottom line you write is that the Belt and Road is about interdependence. And I think that's a good place for us to start our discussion. For you to talk about those key concepts about the opacity, the informal nature of it, and the interdependence. If you could kind of wrap those together and what the thesis of your book was, that'd be a good place for us to open our discussion.
Sure. Those are all very good points and critical to understanding the Belt and Road. Now, on transparency, well, to some extent, China doesn't believe in transparency, but you could also argue that China has a different concept of transparency. Just now in the Belt and Road Forum, there was an impassioned defense of transparency, but it means something different from what we mean. It means essentially visibility from different departments, that every department should know what another department or where a state-owned enterprise is doing. So there are different concepts. There are different ways of looking at the world. There are different cultures. That's a big part of my book. The informality is also very clear. The initiative may change. The initiative many times is negotiated in private. It's not put to paper. Many of the agreements take that nature. One of the aspects of my book is that it was written on the road and talking to people. I think that comes across on many pages. I think it's the only way to write a book about the Belt and Road because it's not there on the internet. Not everything is available. And you have to make an effort to try to see how the pieces fit together.
So to pick up on that point, you mentioned, as Eric also mentioned, you mentioned that to a certain extent it being informal, unstructured, and opaque is that they are features rather than necessarily design flaws. But what are what does China gain from having it be informal and unstructured? Kind of from the outside, it would look like that would cause more instability. It would make it more difficult to organize across such a wide swath of projects. So what are the pros on it being informal and unstructured?
That will get us to Eric's point about interdependence. But before I get to that, so the advantages of a certain opaqueness. Well, clearly China can do a number of things that it couldn't do if this was to be discussed in public and you had to reach a consensus. I always wonder about those first few months after the Belt and Road where everyone jumped on the bandwagon and tried to see a way to contribute. And I couldn't help thinking that in the West, in Europe in particular, if a big initiative of this kind was put forward by the top political leader, every intellectual, every businessman the next day would be trying to shut it down because that's the culture, the adversarial culture that we have. If you look at my book, there's a long section about Pakistan where I discuss the long-term economic and social plan for Pakistan. And that's not public, and there's a reason it is not public, because the resistance to it would make it more difficult to achieve the goals. Now, quickly to the question of interdependence, I think the important question here is to ask, why does China need this? Sometimes I see a headline or an op-ed arguing, why doesn't China focus on technology rather than on the Belt and Road? Well, the Belt and Road is about technology. It's about technological development. It's about the technological upgrading of the Chinese economy. The theory behind it, which I think is really, really important to understand, is that China cannot do it within its own borders. It needs a global plan to transform the Chinese economy. And that's a vision they get from their own history, but also incidentally from Marxism, which was also, of course, Marx and Lenin very interested in the idea of the world system, of an integrated world system. And you cannot change your status without changing the nature of the world system as a whole.
I want to come back to this concept of interdependence because you spent a lot of the book talking about it. And it's one of the themes in Chinese history that's very important to understand. And as I was reading your book, I thought it paired very, very nicely with Howard French's 2018 book, Everything Under the Heavens, how the past helps shape China's push for global power. And I really recommend people to read those two books together because there's some complementarity to it. And Howard talks a lot about, again, the interdependence that China had within its own, in Asia, for example, in its relationship with Vietnam and Korea, and even to some extent Japan and some of its neighboring regions. They weren't necessarily countries, but kingdoms and whatnot. And yet here we see again that China's trying to recreate a sense of interdependence. And this is very, very important to understanding the mindset behind the loans issues. And so people are saying, there's the debt trap diplomacy narrative that the United States is pushing very aggressively. But if we're really talking about creating a network of interdependent states with China, then China's not necessarily motivated or inclined to crush these countries on the debt. It wants to create the dependence. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the interdependency that you were talking about in the book?
Right. Well, states, countries cannot develop on their own. They need to be integrated in global supply chains, in relations of economic cooperation, but also dependence. That's how China increasingly sees the world. I think the big change happened because economic globalization has been for 40 years a very important platform of Chinese thinking. But the idea of political and cultural globalization, I think, is relatively new and really arises with the Belt and Road. So now we have a system that is not only economic, it's not just about economic globalization, but a system where countries are also supposed to talk to each other. They're also supposed to articulate their economic plans, to articulate their industrial policies. That's very much the vision that China has. Now, whether this is going back to the past or whether it's new, I think, a rather subtle, at least I tried to make it subtle view of this that I developed in my first book, The Dawn of Eurasia. Well, to some extent, you use the elements from your past, but I think we also need to understand that we're talking about modern China now. And whether we think it started exactly 100 years ago with the May 4th movement or with the Communist Revolution or perhaps even before, it is a different China. And in some sense, there's more in common between modern China and modern West than between modern China and ancient China. That's also, I think, very, very important to understand and don't overemphasize the continuities in Chinese history.
So if we talk about political interdependence, what do you foresee that looking like, especially in the context of the massive kind of power gap between China and many of the other Belt and Road countries? Are we looking at just an intensification of existing bilateral relationships, or do you foresee new institutions being created during the Belt and Road process?
No, I don't. Again, going back to the point about informality, I think China would resist that. How does it work in practice? I think we're finally starting to see it. I think after 5 years, we're starting to see it in practice. We've seen it with Pakistan. We've seen it with Malaysia over the past few months. There's clearly a lot of discussions, consultations going on, and power is being exercised. It moves in both directions, by the way, but obviously China is in the top position and has a lot more leverage and a lot more influence. But I think we've seen also how Malaysia was able to bring down the costs from the East Coast Railway connection considerably by 1/3. And we've seen how Pakistan is claiming to have even changed the nature of the China-Pakistan economic corridor with the new government and Imran Khan to have made it more social, turned more towards jobs and less to heavy infrastructure. So there's a very intense process where the two countries try to influence each other, and we should be aware that China is going to have a lot more influence. But in some respects, political borders are becoming more diffuse.
So with that in mind, there's an element of politics in all of this. And yet when we talk to the Chinese side of things, they say, no, this is purely an economic initiative. This is not a political initiative. If you talk to the United States, they're very, very clear. Mike Pompeo, the United States Secretary of State, has come out time and time again saying this is about the expansion of Chinese political and military power around the world. They're entrapping countries with debt, and then once these countries can't pay, they then switcheroo and the politics and the military take in. You alluded to that this is part of the creation of a new Chinese world order. And implicit in that, or explicit in that, is the exercise of political power. Can you talk about the nexus of economics, politics, and military?
Right. That's a good question. I think we need a little bit of conceptual clarity here. So obviously, it's about politics. If by politics you mean something like economic policy, industrial policy, China doesn't think of economics and politics as separate in that way. On the contrary, of course, they think that the economy should be subject to political guidance and political direction. What they mean when they say it's not political is that it is not geopolitical, that it doesn't reflect a certain plan to change the distribution of power in the global order. I, of course, disagree with that, and it's something I've been discussing with my Chinese colleagues and Chinese friends in the academia, in the think tanks here. From the very start, when I started arguing with them, there's a passage in my first book where I go to a think tank and the response I get is, you only think this is about geopolitics because you have been educated in this Western way of thinking. But we, the Chinese, we think differently. In that book and in this second book, I try to show that, even if China doesn't want it to be geopolitical, it will be geopolitical. It already is. But I, of course, also think that China knew this from the beginning and planned accordingly.
And in that vein, how do you foresee Western countries reacting to the Belt and Road as it becomes bigger and more developed? I think we've seen quite a divergence of reactions so far. With Italy joining and the United States, raising all of these concerns. But what do you think Western reactions will look like in the future?
It looks like a complete fragmentation, and I guess it will look like that. I don't think that will be corrected. We have Western countries, even members of NATO, let us say, all over the place on the Belt and Road. Some countries very enthusiastic about it, and other countries, in particular the United States, trying actively to undermine the initiative. I don't think this is excessive language by now. And of course, India very skeptical. Many countries in Europe very skeptical. Australia, just to give another example, Australia, yes, the government in Canberra is skeptical with the current government. It could change with the Labour government. But incidentally, a province has joined the Belt and Road. So you actually have a situation in Australia where one of the states is negotiating directly with the Chinese state on the Belt and Road, whilst the government in Canberra remains very skeptical about that. And I think it's a good example, a good metaphor of the confusion and the fragmentation that you get all over the West.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
So the United States, as you pointed out, has been adamant in warning other countries not to sign up for Belt and Road. And yet, countries in South America, the Caribbean, and in Africa in particular, are eager to sign up, it seems like. They're looking at the United States and the IMF warnings from Christine Lagarde and others and saying, you know what, we hear you, but we're taking a hard pass. What are the kinds of things that if you were to sit down and talk with African leaders to help educate and guide and counsel them about their negotiations and understanding the Belt and Road relationships, that you would tell them if that was in fact the opportunity that was provided to you?
Well, you have to be tough at negotiating these things, as China is very tough. You got to get better at it. I think some countries have been doing a good job. But clearly, as we saw in the case of Malaysia, there's a lot of room for negotiating better when it comes to negotiating with China. I think that's the most important. And I never really subscribed to the idea of the Belt and Road as a debt trap and a form of debt trap diplomacy. It will depend very much on how good a negotiator you are. And I think some countries will benefit from it and others will not. It's still, I have to say, and tell me if you find counterexamples. It's still very difficult to find a country where you could say it's in worse shape now than it was 5 years ago because of the Belt and Road. Maybe that will happen in the future, but so far there are countries that have practically not benefited from it. But to be in worse shape than 5 years ago, I don't see examples of that.
I guess that just depends on your view on the debt. I mean, Djibouti now has 90% of its external debt to China. And they're a Belt and Road country, and people are saying that this is potentially vulnerable to them. I mean, and I guess I want to just push you a little bit. You said you got to get tough. But let's take a country like Senegal, for example. No real natural resources, massive trade deficit with China. It doesn't have a lot of leverage over China to get tough. It's a Belt and Road country now. When you say get tough and got to get better at negotiating, what is a small country like Senegal, which could be Ghana, it could be Botswana, it could be any of these countries, or even Kenya for that matter, which just lost the second phase expansion loan for the standard gauge railway. When you say get tough, what specifically are you saying that these smaller countries should do to leverage themselves?
Well, the example I'd give you, maybe one could say it's not a small country, but Malaysia clearly threatened China or at least raised the possibility of canceling all these projects that are important for China and where China had already invested considerable political and financial capital, and that got them to a better position. Some African countries are not going to be in such a good position, and they don't have the same kind of skills that Mahathir brought to the new Malaysian government. But at the limit, you could drop out. That's always a possibility, isn't it? I think the problem many times is that they have no alternative. There's no alternative proposition coming from Europe or coming from America. That would also benefit them. I think Djibouti, obviously, I was in Djibouti for 3 weeks, a little over a year ago. Many problems in Djibouti, of course, starting with the political regime. That's where I would start. But you do see some results from the heavy investment. You do see the country becoming a global hub for logistics, for ports. And that's something that Djibouti has benefited from. A country that really has no natural resources, not even agriculture, volcanic land. So it is a difficult analysis, which no one seems to be very interested in doing, carefully going to all these countries and see what is the positives and the negatives and reaching a final evaluation.
Speaking about Djibouti, obviously it became famous for hosting China's first overseas military base, which is and that expansion is frequently linked to Belt and Road as a larger project as well. To which extent do you see as Belt and Road goes on, that it will require an enlargement of China's international military footprint? Are we looking at possible future bases?
Yeah, no, I have no doubt about that. I think we'll be looking at them very soon, if not already, as seem to be news of a small base in Tajikistan, for example. I think we'll have others all over the Indian. Again, the dynamic, you could ask, is this something deliberate, thought from the start, or something that China will have to do irrespective of the original plans? A little bit of the story of the American empire throughout the 20th century. I don't think American decision makers started with the idea of having 800 military bases all over the world, but that's where they are now. And China will see the same dynamics. You have economic interests abroad. You have many of your citizens working and living abroad, and I think we'll have incidents affecting those economic interests and perhaps, hopefully not, those citizens, and China will be forced to move in. I remember a conversation in Djibouti where a Chinese businessman says that he feels more comfortable because there's a military base there. What does this mean? Well, I think it means two different things. First, it means that the country is potentially more protected from terrorism or insurrection or civil war. That's the benign meaning of the sentence. The less benign meaning of the sentence is that the Chinese businessman will be more comfortable because the risk, for example, of nationalization will be smaller if there's a Chinese military base there. That's another consideration. But again, it's not something, we can talk about the different values, and I think we will later in the podcast, but this is not something we haven't seen before with the British and American empires, where economic and political influence are fused together and they work to advance each other in turn.
Normally, when there are changes on the magnitude that you're talking about in the international order, as you've alluded to the British and the Americans, war has not been very far behind. Now, I'm not necessarily a subscriber to the Thucydides trap, where that said that inherently China and the United States are destined for war as an incumbent power is challenged by an ascending power. However, though, there is a lot of precedent for when these tectonic plates start to move, that things shake. When you look down the road and you see the expansion of China's military footprint, you see the liberal world order that a lot of us are accustomed to, and the Western-led international order that has basically run the world for the past 70 to 80 years since the end of World War II, coming to at least to be changed, if not to be in many parts of the world overturned by a rising Chinese influence. What are we looking at in the year 2049 when you write that the Belt and Road is expected to be finished and will move into a different phase? What's the world look like in the next 20 to 30 years in your world?
Well, I think that's the most important question we can ask now. Are we heading towards a major conflict, a major global conflict between China and the United States? I should start by saying that the idea of Thucydides' trap to me is, not worth wasting your time on. Just a very simple, very primitive formula.
He got a lot of mileage out of that book, by the way.
Sure.
He really got a lot of mileage out of it.
Of course, I think even here in Beijing, where people seem to like the book a lot. But that's a very simple, rudimentary formula that's not going to help us a lot. It's a very complicated new world, not so much with interdependence, but also with a global system that in some respects works on its own, and in some respects has become more powerful than states themselves. A global system of technology, of trade, of infrastructure, of currency. All this, I think, changes the nature of the game. And I would predict, and I have to check back again in a couple of decades, but I would predict that we're going to have forms of conflict, almost permanent, of the kind that we already see with the trade war. But I don't see that there's the room and the space for countries to actually head into major open military conflict anymore. I know many people have made this prediction in the past and been proven wrong, but it is a new world, certainly a new world where states are no longer entirely sovereign. And that has its negative aspects, but I think its positive aspects as well, namely by making conflict less likely, in my opinion.
So as you alluded to, the Belt, one of the big features of the Belt and Road is that it challenges the values of the current liberal global order. How do you feel that it challenges it? Like what are some of the value differences between those two orders?
We've talked already about one thing I think is important, transparency, the idea of public reason, going back all the way to Kant. It's really critical to our societies. Even when we feel that a process has not been transparent, we regard it as a failure that has to be corrected next time. Human nature is what it is, flawed, and so on. But we aspire towards an ideal of transparency. I think China, the question is not so much that they fall short. We in the West tend to appeal, please, a little more transparency. The question is that China does not aspire to the same ideal. It hasn't gone through the same process that we've been through the same ideas, ideas of enlightenment and public reason. And so its values are different. And transparency of the Western kinds is certainly not a value that China would treasure. I think also the question of the role of morality in politics. We are very uncomfortable with moral language in politics. I think it's pretty easy to trace that back to Machiavelli and even the Greeks. There's a discussion about religion and morality should take place in private life. Politics should be realpolitik. And China, to some extent, of course, does not subscribe to this. We're seeing a heavily moralized language. Countries are supposed to be grateful. They're supposed to be friends. When a country does not do what China expects it to do, it has been ungrateful. Whereas I think, the language we're used to, the language that the United States would use or that Germany would use in the context of the European Union would be something like the country X has not honored its commitments. But that's not the language that China uses. I speculate along these two dimensions in the book, but one could look for many others. It's a tricky business to try to identify different values. You need a lot of experience of the different societies and a lot of historical subtlety. So I try not to go overboard in my book, but it's already clear that there are lines along which you can draw divisions and separations.
I'm curious, you're in Beijing now. You have been talking to people in the academic circles and think tank communities, as you talked about. What's the reaction that they have to your book? You're a foreigner talking about China, something that is absolutely essential to the current geopolitical outlet and economic outlook for China. What's the reaction to your book from Chinese folks?
Right now there's a certain uneasiness about having a foreigner write about the Belt and Road, in the sense that he will not subscribe to what is the official view, and there's an attempt to control the narrative as the Belt and Road gets into trickier waters. I think some people recognize that the book tries to be impartial, tries to look at the question from both sides. I describe the book often in my talks and conferences as trying to make the Western view of the Belt and Road and the Chinese view of the Belt and Road communicate and talk to each other. Since they don't talk to each other in the real world, they might as well talk in my book, and that's what I try to, in some sense, make happen there. But the mood in Beijing now is not so much to have an open dialogue about that. There's a return to first principles and pushing forward with the Belt and Road. So in some sense, it is difficult. One also has to realize, of course, this is obvious, but it is even more vivid if you're here, that there are conversations you can have in private, and then there are conversations you can have in public, and there's a difference between them. There are many different levels at which to communicate in China. That's another reason to come to China, to be here, because certainly you cannot get a sense of what is happening here from the outside, or coming here twice a year for a high-level conference.
Bruno Maçães is the author of The Belt and Road, A Chinese World Order. Really indispensable reading. Again, I recommend it in the context of Howard French's 2018 book, Everything Under the Heavens. Both of those together are fantastic books, and understanding where we are going in terms of the Chinese outlook for foreign policy, for economic policy and whatnot, and its relations particularly with places like Africa. So, Bruno, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insights, and I hope more people read the book. If people want to follow what you're reading and writing and what your activities are, where can they follow you on social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Maçães Bruno. I think it's pretty easy to find me there through Google or otherwise. And check out also my first book, which is very different, talks about Turkey, Russia, European Union, and tries to put the Belt and Road into the wider Eurasian world. The second book, Belt and Road, is a detailed examination of the project itself.
Well, we'll have links to both of those books in the show notes. Bruno, thank you so much, and best of luck with the rest of your trip in China.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was a pleasure.
Cobus, the number one takeaway from the discussion with Bruno for me was this idea of how the Chinese are using a different moral structure, a different outlook, and it's so imperative on African negotiators to understand this, and the need to understand Chinese language, history, politics, culture, in order to understand what they're doing and how they're thinking and how they're seeing the world. Because I've said this many times, and I really firmly believe it, the Chinese see the world in very, very different terms than the West does. And so much, I think, of the African geopolitical foreign policy outlook has been shaped by the West. And the fact that the Chinese are coming at this from a totally different perspective, they're playing by a different set of rules, and I'm not convinced that everybody really understands that yet. And the fact that this issue of transparency and opacity is all part of that, and understanding it. Is it a feature? Is it a bug? We're not really sure. But it's in that spectrum. And sometimes it's a feature, sometimes it's a bug, but understanding when is super hard. And so this is the reason why I think we need to see more African negotiators really apply themselves to Chinese history, culture, language, and politics.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this is such a big tectonic. We keep going back to that word tectonic, like shift, which essentially shakes all of the buildings around us as it happens. And that will definitely lead to people feeling uncomfortable and maybe even feeling a little bit traumatized in terms of of seeing things that they're really accustomed to, ways of doing things that they're very accustomed to suddenly changing. But at the same time, I think it looks like the kind of trauma that people in the West are feeling about this is going to be different from the trauma that Africans feel about it. Because, you mentioned that obviously Africa has been extremely influenced by Western thinking and Western ways of arranging politics, but that it's not like they became used to that out of free choice. Kind of that itself was a process of being forcibly and frequently in a very kind of unhappy way being kind of inserted into a system that isn't your own. And there's a lot of discussion, I think, in Africa about how African politics should be Africanized. What are African core values and how they should be expressed in political realms. And I think this issue that he mentioned of the moral language of geopolitics, the way that there is all of this language of gratitude and kind of like friendly relations and in Chinese geopolitics, there might be an interesting kind of overlap with ideas that Africans have about how politics should work. How African politics could work if it weren't always fitted into a Western system. I'm no expert on African political philosophy, but I think it would be very interesting to see whether there are overlaps there, and ways of new thinking about what politics could mean.
And to that end, the concept of interdependence that he talked about, to me, is the reason why I think the debt trap narrative will fall flat and continue to fall flat. That China wants to create dependence. It doesn't necessarily want to exert firm political power that is direct political power. I think that's a very colonial way of looking at power, a very imperial way in the old 20th century, 19th century view of power. And I think the Chinese, the way they've exercised power over the millennia, is very, very different. And that's one of the reasons why we have to look at this approach in different ways. He talked a little bit about in the book the creation of industrial parks as part of the strategy to foster interdependence. I've never seen the industrial parks as part of a bigger geopolitical strategy. And Bruno put it as part of this idea of, by connecting these countries with, state-owned enterprises, infrastructure development, all the different things that come along with IPs, it's fostering that interdependence. And I thought that was super interesting. It was a little bit disappointing that people will say, African countries have to be more assertive. They have to stand up. I just don't know what a country like Ghana or Senegal, the smaller countries, can do to stand up to China. There's not much leverage that they have. So I think in this, they've basically said, we're leaning into the Belt and Road. We're turning away from the U.S. in that sense. Thank you, U.S. We hear you, but you know what? Forget it. We're putting our cards down with the Chinese. I just don't think that they have a whole lot of options. And at the end of the day, they have fewer options than, say, Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia or the Pakistanis as well, which have regional geopolitical influence based on their strategic location in proximity to China.
Yeah, no, 100%. I 100% agree. But of course, Malaysia has that kind of leverage now, but it didn't always, and a few decades ago, Malaysia was in a very similar position as Africa is now. And this is a multi-decade project, so who knows where Africa will be in 30 or 40 years. But I think the issue then also becomes, it's while I was listening to him, I kept thinking that, this really comes down to national politics all the time. The potential for a population to get a really good deal out of China is crucially dependent on which government they have talking for them in that negotiation room, and so a lot of it comes from these kind of larger kind of systems of influence, but a lot of it also comes from the specific people these populations elect, and that's always a thing in Africa, because leadership in Africa can be not great. So I think it draws us back to this issue of like what African people actually want from their own governments.
Okay, after 3 shows now in the past few months on Belt and Road, I promise you we're going to take a break from Belt and Road for a little bit. But I am glad that I had an opportunity to speak with 3 different people, Eric Meister-Yino, Zheng Zhu, and now Bruno, about different perspectives on the Belt and Road, because it is so important. And it is not fixed. It is fluid in its definition and whatnot. So we hope that these different conversations have helped you frame you're thinking about Belt and Road the same way it has for us. I have to admit, I'm still a little bit confused. I'm sure, Cobus, you are too. But this is not something that we're expected to understand, quickly and easily and cleanly. It's not like the Marshall Plan, which was simple and easy, and that was a policy and a decision that was made at a fixed beginning and almost a fixed end. And boom, infrastructure was built. Europe was on its feet. We're done. This is not it. So it's different. It's complicated. But we will take a break from it. We'll get back to some different topics. In the meantime, we would love to hear what you think. Cobus and I were always accessible via email. People have been emailing me questions. Cobus, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've just been writing back these monster responses to people when they ask me questions. And and I just love the discussion. So if you want to talk about China, Africa, please email us. Let us know what you think. Send us your questions. Send us your comments. We love getting the feedback. It's a lot of fun to know that you're listening and you're engaged in what we're doing. So people send me an email. I'm like, cool, let's write it, send it back. So be prepared to get a long email back, and I'm responding within 24 hours to most mails. And Cobus, you can find him at cobus@ChinaAfricaProject.com. And you can find me at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another show. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus @Stadinsky or Eric @EOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.